If you saw my last video, you'll know that I really did like part 4. So going into part 5, I kinda had some high expectations. Also, it is one of the most popular parts, for a multitude of reasons. Before I even got into the series, I saw a lot about part 5 specifically. You know, the music, the scenes in it, the specific stands in there. I'm not too sure why, but it seems like this part was the most popular of any of them beforehand. Like, of course, there was part 3, which introduced stands in the first place, but this part was really my introduction to the series, because everything I saw about the series was pretty much about this part. I guess it was at the height of its popularity once this came out. So that's why I had high expectations going in, and thankfully it lived up to those expectations. I finished my rewatch of the series recently too, so I got to see this a second time, and it made me like part 5 even more than the first time. Overall, part 5 ended up being one of my favorites. I'd say it's even in my top 3. I can understand why other people wouldn't like it, but at the same time, I think it had so many strong parts to it. First of all, it remains faithful to the source material, but it also elevates it. Besides the beautiful aesthetics, visuals, and the different designs that were adapted there, as well as the great acting and music, there were a few things added in or just switched around that really did help out the story. Since this is a review, obviously we're going to have some spoilers in here. So if you don't want to be spoiled, that's your warning. But one of the examples of something that the anime added that wasn't in the original comes during Naranja's death scene. It's such a small addition, but I think it's really good, and it speaks for how good this adaptation is. When Naranja dies, there isn't a scene of Fugo in the manga reacting to it, but the anime adds this. He doesn't know what happened, and it's just showing him walking alone in an alleyway. But such a small scene and such a small addition, it adds so much to an already good and emotional scene. And I think it's a good example of how good of an adaptation the anime is. But let's talk about the actual story itself and things that were in the manga, because that's really the core of what we're reviewing. I'll start with Giorno. So, he's pretty underrated in the sense that some people say he's too boring, one note, or just has no personality at all. And I can kind of get why people would say that. Maybe he's not as bombastic as Joseph or Josuke. Maybe his morality and compassion for others aren't as overt as Jonathan. Or maybe his stoicism and determination don't hit as hard as it does with Jotaro. I can get that. But a character is there, and all those traits that I just covered, those are expressed through Giorno at some point in the series. And I think saying he has no personality is a gross understatement. The last 4 protagonists all had their own unique natures, but their personalities were far more prominent than Giorno's, I think. I would even say the same goes for protagonists after him. Giorno, on the other hand, feels a lot more subtle with how his personality is portrayed, but it is there, and it's pretty obvious right from the first episode. He's kind-natured and compassionate, valuing life just like Jonathan, who technically is his father. He's bold, he's cunning, and he's willing to take risks for others that he cares for. He's determined, with others thinking that this might almost be to a fault. I think one of the best displays of his character comes right towards the middle of the part, during the White Album arc, starting from there up to the point when they step on the boat. From this battle with Mista up to the point when they actually betray the boss, you really get to see a lot of his personality shine through here. I will say though, the rest of the cast is equally as compelling as Giorno, some even more so I can get why he might be overshadowed by some others. Of course, many people think Bruno steals the show to an extent, and I honestly think that too. He definitely is one of my favorites of the story here. He reminds me of Caesar or Gyro in that way because these 3 characters are in a unique position, where they're nearly as important as their respective MCs, with Gyro and Bruno both acting as guides for that MC as well. But his importance doesn't really take away from the rest of the cast for me though. He manages to be compelling without making the others irrelevant, which is one of the strongest aspects of this part. The whole crew was great, and not just the crew, but even the villains there. There's some really cool antagonists here, and a lot of cool abilities for those antagonists too. Risotto is definitely one of the coolest for me. Pesci and Prosciutto too. And I love the appearances of old characters like Koichi at the beginning and obviously Polnareff at the end. So just like the last few parts, I actually had some spoilers going into them, but I never actually knew that Polnareff was going to show up in this part, so when it happened, I was actually watching this with my friends for the first time. I wish they recorded my reaction, but it was pretty hype. But those older characters coming in don't take away from any of the newer ones here. Another character that I really enjoyed was Doppio, which also really plays into how I feel about Diavolo, because similar to Giorno, I've seen people say that he's not as interesting because we don't get to see much of him. And I feel like I should have a section talking about Diavolo because he is the main villain after all, so let's talk about him for a bit. Especially after Kira, I can see why he might not live up to expectations, but I think he's a perfectly fine villain. He and Doppio are technically separate characters, but at the same time they're still the same person. So yeah, we don't really get to see much of Diavolo because we see Doppio. It's not really too different from Dio either. Like, for Kira, at least we got to see him throughout the entirety of part 4. Dio in part 1, Cars in part 2, Pucci in 6, Valentine in 7. Like, we get to see them all the way through, but Diavolo's not the first or last villain that only shows up towards the end. Dio did that in part 3, he was basically in the shadows the entire time and didn't do anything. And then Toru in part 8, he doesn't show up until really late in the story. So I don't think it's bad that he doesn't show up right away, and I think it really fits for his character too. Whereas I didn't like the fact that Dio was pretty hands-off in part 3, I liked here that Diavolo wasn't really involved right away. Like, we did get to see a little bit of him throughout the story, but I think it really fits him. Him being so mystifying to the viewer is intentional because of the fact that his whole objective is complete anonymity. Doppio and Diavolo are one and the same, so we do get to see Diavolo's personality in life through Doppio. He's so obsessed with anonymity that he uses Doppio as a cloak. barely even having his own identity because that's what he wants. The way he strings along Doppio too is a perfect example of his personality. Everyone around him is a tool for him, to the point where the man who is technically him is simply a disposable asset solely there to help him. Doppio remained loyal to him to the end, and Diavolo didn't even care or notice that he was gone. I can make a whole video essay on Diavolo alone, and I actually might do that, because I think he's a genuinely amazing character, and all the nuance that I'm outlining here, I don't think it's unintentional. I don't think anything is wrong with how he's written, or the concept of his character and how it was executed. Of course, if you don't like him, that's fine, but I think the reasons people dislike him, I don't really understand them because of all the stuff that I just outlined. Also, somewhat unrelated, but I think his design is my favorite of any of the JoJo villains besides Pucci. All the villains have great designs, so it's tough for me to choose favorites, but Diavolo's is insanely good. And outside of Bruno or Doppio, I think my favorite character in this part's definitely gotta be Mista. I genuinely do not think he has a bad scene at all. The way he's written is just as great as Bruno, even if he doesn't hold the same importance. His dynamic with every other character is great too, and his personality in general is really charming. And he's definitely the most hilarious of the cast too. Speaking of that, the way the story is written too, it's definitely one of the most emotional JoJo parts for me. But even with that raw emotion there, I think it's able to balance that pretty well with some nice optimistic parts almost, and also a lot of good humor throughout. JoJo has some good humor in general, especially parts 3 and 4, and surprisingly 7 despite its tone, but I think this part was really funny too. Really the only complaint I have with this part is Fugo, because I thought he was honestly a really cool character. I know he has his own novel, and I know he was planned to betray them at some point, but I feel like it kind of leaves a lot to be desired because he just leaves halfway through the story and then he never shows up again, like not even a mention or a cameo later on, which is why I really like that scene that the anime added when he reacts to Naranja's death, because not only is it a powerful scene, but it lets us get to actually see him again and see how lonely he is without a squad. I actually haven't read Purple Haze feedback, and I might in the future, but really that's the only thing I can say about this part that I wasn't too fond of, because I wanted to see more of Fugo. I thought he was really cool, and he only really got one fight too. And the fight was really cool. I would love to see more of his stand as well. But I guess I will have to read the novel for that. And again, I think that speaks to the strength of how everyone was written in this part, because my biggest issue was the fact that we didn't get to see one of them enough. Everyone in this squad was great. I would say Abbacchio is definitely the weakest of the squad for me, but not that he's badly written, it's just that everyone else is so amazing that I'd have to say he's the least interesting, but he still is really interesting. I love his backstory and all, especially his design. And again, this is just another statement for how good everyone's written here. The character who was the least interesting to me was still interesting to me. I really do love this part. And watching it a second time really helped me see a lot of the things that I outlined here, especially the things with the characters, because before I kind of did agree that Diavolo was a little bit boring, and Giorno was a little bit boring too, but going in and watching it again really made me love the part a lot more, and really appreciate all the characters in it. The cast is amazing, the overarching story is great too, the themes and emotions in the story are powerful, and I hope no one gets mad at me for saying this, but I feel like this is a better version of Part 3 if anything. Like, not that Part 3 is bad at all, but I feel like this has a lot of similarities to Part 3, but it executes it way better. Like, the way it's set up is a journey of a cast of characters, trying to uncover some shadowy figure and defeat him, as well as learning more about the story behind stands along the way. And it does continue Part 3's story because it's Dio's son and Poldaref's involved too, and the whole tie to Part 3 with Diavolo and the arrows. It's so great because it's its own story that could stand on its own, but it still is deeply connected to the rest of the series. But let me know what you think below. I really enjoyed the part and hopefully you liked my analysis of it. It's a shame though because I only have one more anime part to review and then I'm going to have to go into the manga stuff. And I know it's going to be a long wait for those two parts to be animated. But hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you on the next one, which will be about Part 6. Thank you all for watching.